Now, the so-called low-risk businesses, including shops, factories and workshops, resumed operations in Tehran just a week after reopening in the rest of the country. The reopening announced earlier this month came as official figures showed daily deaths from the coronavirus fell to 73 on Saturday, the lowest since the 12th of March. That brought the death toll to 5,031. Saturday marked the fifth consecutive day with the death toll under 100 in Iran, one of the worst hit countries in the Middle East. The total number of people diagnosed with COVID-19 reached 80,868 as the country recorded 1,374 new cases in the past 24 hours. Now, Professor Seyed Marandi from the Faculty of World Studies at the University of Tehran in Iran has kept a bird's-eye view on the pandemic in the country, and he joins us now via Skype from Tehran in Iran. Professor, as always, it's a pleasure having you on the show. Good evening to you.
Thank you for having me.
Now, do you want to give us more updates as to what's happening on the ground? I would imagine there's so much excitement of people being let out of their homes and onto the streets. Is that the case?
Well, there never was a quarantine in the sense that people were forced to stay at home. In Tehran and in other cities, people were prevented from leaving the provinces. So you could drive around in the city of Tehran or the surrounding areas, but you couldn't leave the province of Tehran. And that was more or less the same about all the other provinces as well. Normal citizens, ordinary citizens were unable to travel. Inside Tehran, though, there wasn't a great deal of incentive for people to move around much because for a period of time shops were all closed and parks were closed as well. So no one was prevented from going to the streets or taking walks or driving around, but there really wasn't all that much to do.
I understand, Professor, that the lockdown is to be lifted in 3 phases, with the easing of restrictions in Tehran being the second. Take us through some of these stages.
Well, you're absolutely correct. What they are doing is that they are gradually opening up, and they're beginning with those shops and those centers that are less likely to help spread the virus. And places like malls are not going to be opened for the time being because, of course, these are areas where large numbers of people go, and the chances for contagion is higher. So that will be in the next stage, and ultimately the plan is to fully open up the economy. Iran, after all, is under tremendous pressure because of the U.S. sanctions. Initially, in the fight against the virus, the Iranians had great difficulty in providing its citizens with test kits. The Americans were preventing Iran from importing them. Masks were also a big problem. They were also being prevented by the Americans from importing masks and anything that had to do with the virus. Gradually, the Iranians were able to produce their own goods. Now Iran is producing all the different masks and kits and supplies, hospital supplies that they need, so they no longer need imports. And now that, therefore, since the government is better prepared and a lot more tests are taking place using Iranian kits, they feel, and since the numbers of casualties and victims are declining, the Iranians feel that because of the economic sanctions, it's very difficult for ordinary Iranians to remain at home. So they feel that they have to begin opening up. So as they are better equipped to deal with the virus, they feel that it's better to begin opening up the economy as well.
And having said that, Professor, what really informed the reopening? Was it, as you mentioned, was it the confidence that the government had on the country's containment measures, or was it simply the drop in the death toll?
I think it was a combination of all of these things. It was a decline in new cases, a decline in the number of people who've lost their lives, the increasing number of tests that are being carried out, and but also I think it's a sense of necessity, because after a certain point, many people who are more vulnerable, they do not have the money to stay at home. And because of the sanctions, the Iranian government's resources are limited. So they cannot really provide all that much money for people to stay at home for a very long period of time. So all of these combined have produced this result. People are hoping that this will go well and that we will not have a major spike in the number of new cases, but we'll have to see. It may be in the coming days and weeks that things become more difficult again. That is the fear at this stage.
But Professor, some of the reports that have been coming through have reported that most Iranians were quite skeptical of this move to reopen the economy and reopen Tehran, only preferring to remain at home and leaving most of the shops in Tehran empty. So what should we read into this kind of skepticism?
I think there are different people with different views on this. Those who are more vulnerable, those who are renting shops or who live in apartments and who pay rent, those who don't have jobs or are not being paid while they stay home, they are deeply concerned about their situation. Or those who have major financial commitments or important financial commitments, they feel that they have to get back to work and that the economy has to be up and running. People like myself are not really very vulnerable, because instead of going to campus, I teach from home. I use this laptop and I teach my PhD classes, my BA classes, and I really don't have much of a problem. I do my research here, so I don't use my office on campus. I've been here for the last few weeks without any serious problem. But that's not the case, and I'm paid, of course, by the University of Tehran. But that's not the case for many Iranians. So many Iranians, I think, would rather stay home, those who are able to do so, I suppose. But those who are financially vulnerable, as I said earlier, I think they feel that they have to go out. So the government, I think, is trying to balance all of these different voices and gradually move forward so that the vulnerable do not reach a state of destitute, while at the same time there's no big spike in the number of new cases.
And earlier today we saw heavy traffic as people got into a frenzy and scrambled to apply for state support, and thus crowding some offices. This is quite alarming. Are you not at all concerned that what we saw earlier today could take the country a few steps back and see a resurgence of the virus?
Yes, that was a mistake, and the government decided to end this mechanism and to have people apply for those loans that you were discussing online. So there were large queues in different government offices in Tehran, which was, as you rightly point out, a danger, because that could cause contagion, especially because many of those people who are applying were elderly citizens. So when the government saw that they made this mistake, they quickly changed policy. And this is, this is something that I think the government, as well as the South African government and all governments, should take into account, because we've never gone through such a thing before. So sometimes the government thinks they're making a good move, giving people loans, and then they fail to recognize that the mechanism that they've designed for people to go and apply for those loans could actually be more dangerous more dangerous than actually the benefits that may come. It may outweigh the benefits that may come from the people obtaining the loan. So these things have to be more carefully thought through.
Now, Professor, the government did something it hasn't done in half a century in March. They went with the cap in hand to the International Monetary Fund to request for $5 billion of emergency funding to help fight COVID-19. Do you foresee a circumstance where the United States, given the antagonistic relations between the two countries, blocking this kind of assistance, because you know that the United States is a majority shareholder in the International Monetary Fund?
Well, it's not a majority shareholder. It has the largest shares, and it makes it very difficult for other countries to obtain a loan without the U.S. consent. But Iran has not taken, it was not cap in hand. Iran is a member of the organization. Iran has been paying its dues for decades, and because of U.S. antagonism, Iran has never been able to obtain a loan for the last 40 years. So the Iranians have been saying that to the IMF that we are in a very difficult situation. Our assets are blocked outside the country. Billions of dollars of Iranian money are stuck in South Korean banks, Chinese banks, under orders from Trump. So the Iranians went to the IMF and said that we pay our dues, we are a member, we want a loan to fight this virus. I think the Iranians knew from the beginning that the Americans were not going to allow them to get this loan, but to a degree the Iranians wanted to show the international community the real nature of the U.S. government. I think from the very start the Iranians were pretty sure that the Americans were going to block the loan.
I mean, $5 billion is quite a huge amount for Iran to just let go. Any plan B, just in case the Americans decide to go ahead and block that kind of aid?
I think that from the beginning the Iranians were not making any real calculations based upon that money, because from the very start I think they did not think that they were going to receive it. The Iranians have over the last few decades become used to sanctions, and they become more dependent on their own population and their own resources. So you do see, especially over the last few years, both under Obama and more recently under Trump, where the sanctions became brutal, very brutal under these two, under both the Obama regime and the Trump regime. The Iranians began to shift towards a more, what they call a resistance economy, where instead of relying on imports, they tried to encourage local production, both of the final products, but also the whole chain to produce different products are now gradually being developed in the country. It's not an ideal situation. Life is difficult, obviously, when you have sanctions, but the Iranians are adjusting. And ironically, the global economic crisis that the world is now facing is not really affecting Iran, because Iran's economy is very much indigenous. It's not export-based. It's not dependent on tourists because of the situation with the Americans. And so the Iranian airline industry, tourism, exports, they haven't been affected. Iranian oil exports have already been limited because of the U.S. sanctions. So the situation, except for the virus itself, hasn't had an economic impact besides the economic impact directly linked to the virus. Unlike other countries where it's caused a huge economic downturn, like what we see in the United States and in Europe and elsewhere, the economy in Iran, because of its isolation, has been pretty much normal.
Now, Professor, do you not think that perhaps apart from the frosty and the antagonistic relations between Iran and the United States, other reasons that that could possibly lead to the United States blocking the aid, as advanced by the Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who said that Iran will divert IMF funds away from the coronavirus relief efforts to fund weapons of mass destruction and fund terrorist organizations? Do you not think that's perhaps one of the reasons?
Well, first of all, the United States is not judge, jury, and executioner in this world. They do not dictate terms to the international community, but that's effectively what they do. The United States, for example, threatens the government of South Africa with sanctions if they do business with Iran. Whether the South Africans accept Pompeo's nonsense or Trump's nonsense is beyond the point. The Americans want to dictate terms, and that's the same sort of behavior that the Americans have with all countries in the international community. What Iran does with its money is its own business and not the business of the United States. And of course, it's the United States that has weapons of mass destruction and has used weapons of mass destruction in Japan. It has given weapons of mass destruction, like chemical weapons, to Saddam Hussein to use against Iranians. I'm a victim of chemical weapons that were given to Saddam by the United States. The United States has invaded country after country in this region, destroyed many countries, supported extremism across the board. So, they've done this despite the fact that the United States is on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. So, for the Americans to make such accusations against Iran is more than bizarre. But I just want to stress a point that I made for your previous question, and that is that when I say that the Iranian economy is not affected by the global economic crisis. Again, it's influenced deeply by the coronavirus. The virus itself has had a very negative impact on the Iranian economy. However, the global economic catastrophe that we're witnessing, because Iran has been separated from the global financial system, that hasn't had a major impact in Iran.
Professor Seyed Marandi from the Faculty of World Studies at the University of Tehran in Iran, joining us via Skype. Thank you so much for your time. Much appreciated.
Thank you for having me.